Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com with a basic tutorial on CSS Grid. The goal here is just to kind of show you the ins and outs of Grid in a brief, not too long video. Now, just so you can see, a useful thing you can do is what I do is I have like a boilerplate folder that kind of has all my basic stuff set up. So like a index.html and my index.html, basically I have commented like all the main CSS frameworks if I want to work with them. I got my CSS file linked up already, jQuery, my JavaScript file, everything that I may typically use, I kind of already set up in my index.html. Then I got my basic JavaScript file, an image folder, CSS file, all kind of set up. This way, it's just easy for me to quickly hit duplicate, and I can just basically be like CSS Grid. That's what this is going to be, and I'm pretty much all set up. Okay, just saying, something you can do to help your workflow. So what we're going to be doing is working with CSS Grid. So first let's configure our CSS before we do our code. You'll see why. Okay, so we go to style, CSS. And then again, I even have some boilerplate here, so that way I don't have to do it all. So like my basic resets, setting up my basic variables. Again, this just saves me time. But what I want to do is set up a grid. So the first thing you need is a grid container. So this is going to be a element that essentially contains the grid. You don't have to call, you can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it grid container, so that way you guys are following. Grid container. And in that grid container, we need to change the display of that container to grid. Okay, kind of like for Flexbox, you would change it to Flex. For grid, we're going to change it to grid. Now you can define it as a grid or an inline grid. So that way, if you could treat it like inline text, if you want to center it, stuff like that. Or it's a grid, which make it a block element, which means you have to center it by using margin auto. Which actually I will do that. Let's do that. Let's make sure that we center it. So actually I want to space this out a little bit just to make this a little bit easier to read, because I'm going to be adding a lot of stuff in here. So display grid, let's set up the margin. Okay, top to bottom, I want the margin to be like 20 pixels just to give a little space. And then I want the center of the element. Okay, and let's actually make the width of this thing 80% or 90% actually. Give it a little space. Okay, and now we have to define like how many rows. So literally what you're doing is you're creating a grid. So you have to think about, like, kind of imagine in your head like an Excel spreadsheet. You'll be able to merge cells and stuff like that, but how many cells do you really need to kind of get the design you want? So what I'm going to do here is just kind of have like one top menu kind of cell that's going to be the top, and then a smaller left side menu and sort of a main area. So that's sort of the grid I want. But to get sort of the dimensions that I want, I'm going to want a 2 rows, 3 column grid. So I'm going to type in grid template columns. I want 3 columns. And what you do here is you're actually going to tell it the space of those columns. And the way you define it is through a fractional remainder, in a sense, FR. Now what it does is that it's going to take the number of FRs between all your columns, divide up the width of the page by that, and then distribute it based on that. So if I were to do, in this case, it's 1 FR. Yeah, I'll just give them each one equal length. 1 FR. So what it does is it's going to divide, since there's 3 FRs between the 3 columns, it's going to take the page, divide it up into 3, and then assign each column that one of those. Now if I were to do 2 FRs for the first one, it would divide up the page into 4 equal sized columns, and then assign 2 of those to that first column. So essentially that's kind of how that works. Okay, and then I want to do the same thing with the rows. Grid rows. Okay, now I do want the top column to be a little bit smaller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the first row 1 fractional FR. But I want it to be out of fifth. I want it to basically be 20% of the grid. On initial thought, we can tweak it afterwards. So I'm going to make the other one 4 FRs, a second row. So basically it's going to divide up the height by 5 and give 4 units of that to the second row. But right now there really isn't a set height, because right now I haven't defined a height, so it's going to do it based on the content. So what I'm going to do is define a height just to make this more visual. So we'll do the height of this container. We'll say 700 pixels. Okay. Cool. So we have the size and whatnot. The problem is, like, I want that whole top row to just be my menu item. So I need to kind of merge those 3 cells, those 3 columns up at the top. So how would I do that? So the way I want to do this is by using a property called grid template areas. And what this does, it's going to allow me to define each row. So the first row, I want everything to just be that one nav. So we'll just call it nav. The second cell is going to be still part of the nav. And again, between each space, it's thinking of the actual class of that particular cell. So I'm saying all 3 of these cells in the first row belong to the nav class. It's going to be part of the nav container, so kind of merge it into one. Now the second row, I want there to be the sidebar, so I'll just say side, and then the main area. Main would be the other 2 pieces. Okay. So basically it'll make the main area 2/3 of the page, and then make the sidebar 1/3 of the page. And then that should wrap that up. Now I need to define these other containers, such as nav, side, main. Cool. So we'll just keep those, give them a quick background color just so we can see them visually. So for the moment, we'll say background color red, background color blue, background color green. Okay, we'll save this. Now we'll go back to our HTML and start defining our elements to make this show up on the HTML. So we go to my HTML. Okay, we head over to body. So I'm going to want to make a div that has the class of grid container, I think it was. Let me just double check. Yep, grid container. And then we want our 3 divs in the middle with our other blocks. So div class equals nav. I'm going to copy and paste that. Well, first let me just do that. And let me just get this all spaced out nice and pretty. Cool, so this is nav, this is side, and this is main. Okay, so let's take a look at how that looks so far. So index, show in file manager. Let me open this up in Chrome. Interesting. Okay, so let's see what happened here. Okay, so we have, for some reason, all 3 rows are in the top. Okay, which is not what it should be doing. So let's examine that. Control inspect. So here's the grid container. This whole thing. Nav is being treated as the first So let's go examine if I type something wrong. See here, nav, side, main, grid template areas, grid width 90%. So there are 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, and 2 rows. And that bottom row should be bigger, and main should be in those rows. Interesting. That's the part I forgot. Okay, so see how I define these areas nav? That's not the name of the class. I actually have to tell the class that it's that area. So I have to type in grid area here and make it know that this is nav. And then do the same thing here. Grid area side, grid area main. Okay, and then that should at least get us most of the way there. Up, there we go. So that's sort of the design we were kind of looking at. Okay, where basically we have the first row, which is the navigation. Okay, the sizing is a little off, but we can work on that. Okay, but that's the basic idea. The nav is that first row. So let's go back and take a look at our row. Now we could do is we could just define it. I could just say, hey, the grid, the first row is 200. Well, let's say 150 pixels. And the grid row is 4. Let's see what happens if we do that. Still looking pretty big. Not quite the way I'd like it. Pix. I'll just say this is 400 pix. We'll define the sizes outright. Save. Why is it doing that? 5. Let's try percentages. 10%. 90%. Oh, I see. Wrong property. Grid template rows. There we go. See, when something doesn't work the way you want it, you probably type something wrong. Those grid template rows, grid template columns. So save. That's much better. Okay, but let's go back to our previous definition of 1FR and 4FR. Save. Let's take a look at how that looks. And there you go. And now you could just start putting in content in there and making it, playing with the borders and making it look and do whatever you want. Okay, but this way you have a very nice defined column. And then here's the thing, far as like mobile responsiveness goes, you can just redefine the grid container and all this in your mobile query, so that way it just becomes one big column. And then for mobile, you're good. Okay, so basically making it responsive becomes really easy because you just basically resize the grid into one column instead of a bunch of grids and rows, making responsiveness quite doable. And plus with this whole fractional units measurement, it sizes perfectly when you do it. So just to kind of demonstrate that, let me bring this up. Okay, so let's make this responsive, and you see it just sizes pretty nicely. Of course, you don't want it sizing too small that it becomes, that it kind of breaks the content inside, but it takes a lot of the effort out. Okay, so that's the basic gist of CSS Grid. Hopefully you guys find this useful. I mean, with CSS Grid and Flexbox, you have a really powerful tools for getting the design that you want. Grid is definitely better when you have sort of a very set grid, kind of like product options. Like let's say you have like a bunch of lists of products that need to spill over from row to row, then probably like something like Grid is going to be a little bit more useful, or a grid box. I mean, a flex box within a grid. You know, it depends what you want. So you play with these things, get a feel for how they're going to play into your workflow and your designs, and design cool stuff. But I'll see you guys later on. Have a great day and enjoy.